My name is Isaiah Smith. You didn't see my previous talk. I work with the Cheyenne Botanic Gardens. I'm our Horticulture and Operations Supervisor. I've been with the Botanic Gardens for about 8 years now in a variety of horticulture roles. Indoor, outdoor, greenhouse, conservatory, landscape. Now we're doing a lot of outreach and things like that. Today we're going to talk real quick about some edible landscaping. What is edible landscaping? It's different than like farming or traditional agriculture. It's utilizing fruits, veggies, herbs, or anything else like that to fulfill traditional ornamental roles. Like I said, it's not a farm. We're not growing rows and rows of the same thing. We're using the aesthetic value of an ornamental plant instead of just a purely ornamental plant. There could be different types and intensities of those plantings depending on how and how much we want to incorporate that into our landscape we have at the moment. And it can and should develop over time. It's not a all or nothing, this is a year, we're going to figure it all out, incorporate it slowly, especially if it's like at a residence or a commercial landscape where you're looking to introduce these ideas. Tearing it all out, put it all in, is not the most successful. It's more of incorporating it as you go. Perhaps something like this, of where we have edible plants fulfilling an ornamental role. Here, Swiss chard or things like that have nice color, nice form, nice texture. There's a kind of an annual color and annual flower value in this herb garden or this vegetable garden. There's some marigolds here for a variety of reasons, both ornamental but also maybe companion planting. Versus something like this, which is more like farm setup, or what we think of with agriculture of rows of the same thing. We're rotating in or out. Still ornamental for sure, I would say. This is very pretty, especially compared to something like turf grass, because that stuff sucks. This is cool. Or, really like this is more like a potager garden or a kitchen garden where, we do have these rows of the same thing. We're incorporating some wildflowers or some herbs, and we just have a really nice overall garden. So how do we incorporate these edible plants into those landscapes? First of all, we should do something called hydrozoning. You may hear this in like landscape design or things like that. Put the wet things with the wet things, the dry things with the dry things. That way we're not watering, this one water-loving plant in the middle of our dry garden. Really doesn't make any sense, and you're going to spend a lot more time taking care of things inefficiently. You're probably not going to take care of them as best as you could because it's a pain. So pair those together. Edible plants with ornamental plants that use similar amounts of water. If they need a little bit more water, put them together. If they can take a little less, put them together. Put your more intensive plants closer to paths or water sources. Intensive being either watering, you got to water it every day. It's up in a pot or something like that. It really needs watered. You need to harvest it often. If it's an herb or something like that, it does not need to be back in the garden. It needs to be up close because you're going to get into it every day. If it's something like a pumpkin or a vine that, once a season you're going to get to it, put it a little farther away. Those demanding crops you need to look at every day so that you remember to check on them every day. Later into this talk, we're going to look at like my house and my property and kind of like my thoughts of it. The side door that I use every day, that's where the herb garden goes in case I need to run out when I'm making dinner to go grab some herbs instead of running all the way around the back side of the house. Do the same thing with your paths as you use it. Whatever you're walking by every day should be something that needs to be seen every day. Same thing with that pumpkin. Water it once a week really well, and then come fall, go harvest it. Stick it somewhere where you're not tripping over it all the time. Think seasonally for your heat-sensitive crops. Our shoulder seasons, spring and fall, we have variable temperatures. It's a little bit cooler than we would like it sometimes. Those plants that we can get an early start on, place them in the sun where it's a little bit warmer. We're going to get a couple more weeks out of that instead of just putting them in the shade. Vice versa, in the summer, we can extend that cool season crop into the summer by putting them into the shade, especially afternoon shade where they get a little bit of relief from that heat of the day, and we can push our greens or our herbs that like to bolt a little farther by having them in the shade. Consider your root system disturbance. If it's a plant or an herb that you're going to need to plant every season, you're doing succession plantings, maybe it's like carrots or beets where you're really getting into the soil. Don't pair it with something that does not like root system disturbance. Large shrubs or bushes. Sometimes native wildflowers have really big underground root systems that don't like to be disturbed. Don't put those carrots and those beets that we need to like fork every so often right beside those, or they're both going to suffer. Pest and diseases can be more prevalent. Vegetable crops notoriously have a lot of problems just because there's a lot of nice succulent growth. It's the whole reason we're getting into it, is it's something we like to eat. Bugs and insects and things like that also like to eat it. With good diversity, it's super manageable. It's kind of more of, if you let your vegetable garden go too bad down the way, your other plants are going to suffer, but hopefully you're not letting that happen. You should see an increase in green waste. There's a lot of waste material in vegetable gardening. We normally are only cultivating a plant for one part and we get rid of the rest of it. Consider composting it, mulching with that green material, incorporate it somewhere, but have a plan for what to do with the rest of it. It's not like a wildflower or a perennial where we can kind of let the leaves blow away or go chop it once in the spring. You know, when we pull up a carrot, are you going to use the carrot tops or are you going to toss them out? That tomato plant, we're only harvesting the fruit, but there are still roots and stems and leaves to consider. You should have a little bit increase in your fertility need. Vegetables are very hungry plants, depending on what it is, and so you may need to plan on a fertilizer or a fertility regimen a little bit different. I think probably the most classic and the easiest way to incorporate edible plants into an ornamental landscape is herbs. If you don't do any kind of vegetable gardening, this is your first year, or you're trying to get back into it, I always encourage people to use herbs. Herbs are the easiest crop to grow. They're the most rewarding because you can use them in almost any way. You can eat them, you can drink them, you can save them with salts or with oils or vinegars. You can give them away as gifts and it looks like you know what you're doing. And they're pretty dry, drought tolerant. They grow great in this environment. If you want an easy, quick win, always go for herbs. They're usually pretty tidy as well, so that's great. You know, if it's not a huge chore and a huge pain to take care of it, you're gonna want to take care of it. And usually they have flowers, they have interesting leaf textures, they always have scents, things like that. So there's a lot of other uses besides that pure culinary factor that you get out of it. But what we're really gonna be talking about is how to incorporate edible shrubs or trees or things like that into the roles that we already use shrubs and trees for. We use a lot of shrubs here in Cheyenne and for most of Wyoming for winter wind protection, something to look at because it's the prairie and nothing else grows, so we have to have nice things. And we tend to default to a lot of evergreens or conifers or plants that look really well one season out of the year, and we kind of ignore all three of them. And we tend to really only plant for the summer, which is our shortest and worst season of all. And then we have this thing called winter, which is like 9 months out of the year, and we suffer through it with our plants instead of going the other way around. Every plant looks great during the summer no matter what you do. A lot of them look really bad during the winter, unless you know what you're doing or you're choosing good varieties. Fruiting plants usually will have you 2 to 3 seasons of enjoyment. You usually get some kind of really interesting spring flower. You're gonna have a summer or fall fruit. Depending on the variety, you may even have some fall color. Or if you're not really good about picking that fruit, you're gonna see birds and things like that coming and getting it. May or may not be what you want, but it is cool to see that as well. This is a clove currant, called clove currant because this wonderful spring yellow flower has a clove scent. So now we have 2 different features. We have both a sight and a smell, which is super great for this one space that could be that overgrown juniper that every other parking lot has. And now we have 2 aesthetic values or scent values, plus we're gonna have a fruit sometime in the late summer or early fall to then either eat fresh, jams, jellies, make it into syrups. Like I said, give it out as a gift later so you look like an awesome gardener. You have so much stuff, you can give it away. Or we have like cherries and amelanchier, same thing. We're gonna have some spring color. We'll have green leaves during the summer. It's a plant, they're gonna be green during the summer. They all look the same. But we'll have a fruit sometime late summer, early fall. Same thing, here's a Bali cherry, I believe. We're gonna have green leaves no matter what, like we said. But in the spring, we're gonna have a nice, cool flower display that we may not have with conifers or some of our hedging type of shrubs. And then we're gonna have that fruit that we can decide to do something with or just leave it and encourage local birds and things like that to come into our yard if that's your thing. Some edible plant alternatives, shrubs. If you happen to catch Scott Skogerbo's talk, a lot of this is in it. Most of these varieties are in one of these. If you happen to catch it, if not, find an extension agent and get you one of these. Lots of good info on vegetables and fruit, especially our small fruits. There are 3, sometimes 4 kinds of currants. They're a small, low-growing shrub, very drought hardy, most of them native to the western part of the US, so they're adapted here. Depending on what color fruit, they have slightly different flavors. but usually a currant is not eaten fresh. People don't like it. It has a very sour flavor to it. Thick skin, big seeds, they're fine, just spit them out. Otherwise, jams, jellies, syrups, a byproduct or a processed food is what they're really known for. And here listed in that same book is what the extension recommends varieties for. I have Red Lake red currant. It is amazing. It is absolutely full of fruit, a little bit smaller than a marble and full of it. They do great. I think they taste good. According to my son, they do. I've yet to have one. Same with like strawberries. He's on it faster than I am. And so that's a good indicator. If a 4-year-old will eat it, it's probably good. Gooseberries are related to currants. They're eaten usually immature, so they're a lot more tart, or they're used into like pies or things like that. Same thing, they tend to be a little bit more drought resistant, but they would appreciate some water. Raspberries, these varieties are all suggested through extension. I currently have Boyne and Heritage. I did 2 different varieties because there's a summer bearing crop and then a fall bearing crop, so I get 2 seasons out of the same space. I also like them too. I leave them up fall and winter. I don't cut them back. I need to do that probably here in the next 2 weeks or so because they help screen the road. I live right on a main road and it's super noisy. It's right where all the first responders shoot down, and so it's a little bit of a screen during the summer and into the fall as well. I thought it would be a good barrier to keep the dog from running against the fence and barking at all the other dogs. Not working so far. I got to find something else for that, but it was a good idea at least. And I haven't experimented too much with the yellow bearing ones, but I know they're super easy to get a hold of. And quite a few of these different varieties, the Botanic Gardens will be selling beginning of June out at the old Arboretum. A few of those were either developed or they were introduced and promoted through that Arboretum. On our table out front, we have that list, so check that out if you're looking for any of these varieties. Shrubs, Scott Scober said serviceberry is his favorite. I'd like to agree with that. Everybody wants a blueberry. We're not gonna have them in Wyoming. Give up on it. Serviceberries are better anyway. It's a bigger bush, it's drought tolerant. I think the fruit tastes better. Depending on the variety, it can be a mix between a blueberry and a raspberry flavor, which is kind of unusual, super great. And they come in all different sizes, so depending on what you're really looking for size, some are self-fruitful, some need cross-pollination. They're great windrow plants to incorporate. The rest of ours are gonna be trees or tree-like plants. Plums come either as an American hybrid or European hybrid. Most plums will need an alternate host or an alternate pollinator. Aside from, is it Mount Royal? I think Mount Royal is the self-pollinating variety. Usually they are sold as tree form. They can also come as a shrub, especially if you find a more like native variety of these American plums. They are more small trees to shrubs, multi-stem, also work great in a windrow. More wild type plums are gonna have bigger thorns, so depending on if you're looking to keep the deer out maybe, or if you're trying to pick it easier, choose the correct variety for that. Cherries, same thing, mostly trees. There are also a lot of really good bush varieties that I think do better than some of those trees. Especially Montmorency has been a good tree variety for us. Once again, I think that one tastes good. The birds have always beaten it to us on the Botanic Gardens. Every year we watch it and it's gonna get ripe, and it's the next day we're gonna get out there and we come out there and there's pits all over the ground because the birds beat us to it that day. Which is another thing to consider with your ornamental or your edible landscaping needs is either a fabric or a netting later in the season to prevent birds and other animals from getting to your crop. Yes, you have a question? Yeah, so there's a bunch of different ways to scare or detract birds. That one's one, flashing lights, anytime you can see a reflection. It kind of depends on the size and maybe the wind, because you may put it up and your neighbor may have to go clean it up. So your mileage may vary. Netting is pretty easy, and it's very easy to take on and take off. Choke cherries, for the most part, are gonna be shrubs, but you can buy. That is a big thing when we talk about pollination. It's not 2 of the same plant, it's 2 different kinds of varieties. It definitely comes down to like the timing of when those flowers are open and if the bees are out as well. Choke cherries, most everybody knows them as that thing that we have to cut out of the fence where the bird gives it to us, even though we never had them in the first place. Canada Red is probably the most common and can be sold as a tree form. Fort Collins Wholesale offers Sucker Punch, which is a suckerless variety of Canada Red. And I think they're starting to experiment with using that as a rootstock for other things so that the roots are not suckering, but we have different varieties of choke cherries. They are working on a yellow fruited variety, I think, at the moment as well. Apples, there's a million different kinds of apples. The biggest thing to look for when you're selecting apples is late flowering and early fruiting. We have a short season. We will always get caught with the snow in May. Make sure that apple variety is either super snow and ice resistant, or it opens up super late, so we can kind of dodge that as best as possible. We have had really good success with, I know Wolf River has done super well in Cheyenne before. Cortland is a fantastic one. Harrell Red or Harrell Sin has done really well for the Botanic Gardens especially. And we're starting to see a lot more of Honeycrisp and Honeycrisp related varieties. It's an older variety that is now being utilized a lot more. From a farmer figuring out a really cool apple variety to you buying it in a grocery store takes about 20 years. So Honeycrisp was the hot thing about 5-10 years ago, and it was first developed in the 70s, and it took that long to get to market. So there's going to be a lot of these that either don't ship very well, they don't transport, they ripen super late or super early, and they're not really accessible in most of our grocery stores. So this is a good way to get really cool and interesting varieties at home use. Pears are going to be fresh eating. There are a few storage pears. Usually those are going to be something that we're eating very quickly from harvest or processing into something else, rather than some of these apples that we could potentially store in the right conditions. If you have a root cellar or a cold basement that's slightly damp, these will do great, where most of your pears you're going to have to eat pretty quick or make into juice or sauce or jelly. So yeah, we're kind of back to this idea of now we kind of know what to use, how do we use it? Our vegetable garden, you know, we can intermix maybe different colored varieties of lettuce or things like that. But if we have any kind of greenery, that's where I would start swapping out, you know, maybe a bland hedge with a bush variety of something, a bush cherry, maybe an apple that's been pruned low, something like that. You can also incorporate some of your smaller ground covers. Lots of the bush fruits are being bred to be smaller and smaller and more productive. So there's always new varieties that are shorter and tend to bear a little better. This is some of our flower displays for the Botanic Gardens, and I think there's a lot of really easy low-hanging fruit, so to speak, for us to incorporate edibles of. We have this really nice purple petunia. We obviously planted it for the purple color. Purple kale, purple cabbage, purple chard, anything like that would fulfill that same function we're looking for of color, but would also give you a crop if this was at your home or something like that. Tall, you know, could be corn, a short corn variety. A lot of them are being now bred for patio or container use. There's a lot of green in here. That could very easily be basil, cilantro, a different herb that we've heard about from today. So you don't have to go one way or the other. It can't be just strictly ornamental or just strictly edible. You can kind of mix and match to the level that makes sense for you and your property. Here's the Children's Village of the Botanic Gardens. It's a 1-acre site where millions of kids are running around every day. And you can see that we have intentional spots for our vegetable garden. Kind of have this wilder area. Most of this is herbs. There's a few, I know there's always like tomato plants that come up in here from where a tomato was eaten or it was thrown across at the rock and things like that. But it still looks good, and that's the whole function of this garden, is to look good, but we also have a productivity out of it. This is early into the season. You can see that our sweet peas, you know, asparagus, things like that are just barely going. We have herbs incorporated here in the background. There's some type of allium. This might even be a sorrel or a spinach, but we have more wildflower type plantings, some rudbeckia. Here's marigold, large grasses, but this whole space still defines the basic concept of a garden. It's plants that look good, but this is the amount of agriculture they want in that particular garden versus it being just a full-on farm plot. There's a little bit of give and take. Some quick pictures I grabbed. You know, there's different ways to do this. You could just do some in-ground beds. You could do raised beds. Neither one is more or less correct than the other. It's going to come down to both function. I like raised beds because I don't have to bend over. I don't have to get on my knees. Of course, you have to build them, so there's that cost of it, and keep the soil correct. But they look really nice, and that's one reason I really like them. They're pretty easy to keep clean in between. Where with this in-bed system, it looks a little bit more natural. It looks kind of more like that traditional ornamental garden of beds along the fence line or outside the area with the turf. We can still have that turf to go play in the yard with, but we don't have to just have shrubs and flowers. We can have some other things. I like here that they've got a little raspberry patch in the middle. A tree, perhaps it's a fruit tree. And then this is easily just a bunch of ornamental plants, but right there, there's for sure an apple. There's even a couple of them growing on. This looks like it could have been divided right there with vegetable gardens in the front. So that same thing when it comes to intensity, those plants that are bigger, taller in the back that don't need a whole lot of work are farther away. Those that do need work more often are closer and more accessible. Same with your raised beds of if they're big or small, those smaller plants that you just have to reach over make more sense to have on the edge, where some of our bigger ones we're going to push farther back. So design for zoning, I said at the very beginning to use the concept of hydrozoning, and I apply that further when I do designs or we're talking about new gardens. Of all of my gardens, especially at my house, have kind of a zone idea. Our first zone is the most intensive in regard to either water or maintenance or both. It's the closest to the water sources because if I don't have irrigation, so I have to hand water everything. The stuff that gets watered is the stuff beside the hose. If I have to drag the hose all the way behind the house, it's probably not gonna get watered today. Planted along the main pathways or near the recreation areas. I enjoy being in my yard. Those things that are nearby where I am, I'm gonna look at more often. When we look at pictures of my house, I'm going to show you the side of the house that I look at like once a year, and there's nothing in it for that reason. Zone 2, a little less water or maintenance. Maybe it only needs it once or twice a year or twice a week. That's the far extreme of where my hose reach, so that on one day of the week, I just have to stretch the hose all the way out, water it real quick. Maybe it can be a little bit more drought tolerant and I don't have to water it if we've had a good rain season. Planted farther back in beds as well. Like I said, those taller plants, those bushier plants, or those crops that don't need managed often can go farther away so that I don't have to get to them. And then zone 3 is the back 40 of the acreage of where I'm never going to get to this week. Maybe I'll get to it this month. Absolutely the farthest from the water. I'm taking that water out there, buckets or getting a couple of hoses linked together or something like that. Planted around the perimeters or from higher demanding spaces. This is where I like to use vining squash, especially the fall bearing squash that I don't have to pick every week to keep them productive. I'm trying to grow a couple of pumpkins for the end of the season. It goes farther away because I don't need to get out there as often. So here's my house. Buy Microsoft Paint or something. So you can see, anytime you're landscaping or doing designing, please know where the sun is. This is my front door. I go out it once a week, maybe, because this is the driveway and there's a side door right here. So I know that for my zone of intensity, this is primarily where I'm walking every day versus this spot. In regards to our north and south, it's also important to know where our sun orientation is. If you're in the previous class, they talked about greenhouses and how the sun moves throughout the day and throughout the season. We know that the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. South is best. It's hot during the summer, it's cold during the winter. But the sun is also in different positions throughout the year. It is lower in the sky in the winter, higher in the summer, which means that our shadows are a little bit different throughout the season. Late day is always hotter than early day. The sun has heated up the earth for many hours and is slowly letting it out. So my sun rises here in the east, so I know this side of the property is going to get a lot of really good east sun. I know over here is not catching that eastern sun early in the day. South side, kind of not the hottest, but getting close to the hottest part of the day. Lots of really good sun, and I know this portion here caught that east sun in the morning and it's catching it right now. So we're getting a few more hours out of this section. Luckily this is a driveway, but there's nothing that's growing on the north side of the building over here. My house does cast a shadow, but during the middle of the summer, this is actually now far enough away from the shadow of my house that it's in full sun during the middle of the day. And then here at the west, sometime between like 2 and 5, maybe even a little later in the day, that's our hottest portion of the day. If I have a plant on the west side of my house, it's going to be able to cook. Unless, of course, I have a property like I do. I live pretty much downtown, so there's a house right here. So actually, west is pitch black for me. That our houses are about 6 foot apart from each other, maybe a little bit bigger. The sun's not getting down in here, which is why it doesn't say garden right here. But I know that on this portion, there's a fence right here. Later in the day, this shadow gets longer and longer. My house is blocking this portion of this garden. So with your properties and your landscapes, think about where the sun is throughout the day, and that's going to tell you where your heat and your water needs throughout the day. Speaking of water needs, we need to know where it comes from. My water I have a tap right here and I have a tap right there. I'm also thinking about doing rain barrels in the future. Rain barrels are going to be situated where my downspouts are. I'm not going to take them really farther out than that because then I'm spending my time to move water uphill, more or less. This shows what my thought process is with my zones of intensity. Green is zone 1, it's the closest to the water. It's right beside this driveway. I walk in 2 to 3 times a day. Here's the side that I come in. We don't have AC in our house, and so if we use the oven or the stove during the summer, it's unbearably hot. So we actually now have an outdoor kitchen we built on the patio. So I'm out here really often during the summer as well. So this portion of my landscape is where I'm in 2 to 3 times a day. So I'm looking at it pretty often. It's really close to my water sources, and so I'm able to water that really quickly on my way to work or my way, to the bank or something like that. Where this set is for sure right here, I know this is absolutely where my 100-foot hose will reach when I'm doing like this and no farther. This is my driest gardens that I have, because also not only do I have to drag the hose out there, I've got to drag it back. Maybe I'll do it this week, maybe I won't. This stuff can take dry really well, and I know if I happen to have some dry crops, this is where I would stick it in. But those leafy greens, those herbs that need a lot of water, they better be right here or they're not gonna make it. I also have a few raised beds here in my southeast portion of the yard. Most of this portion catches a lot of really good sun, so I get a lot of time throughout the year for that. When my wife bought this property, everything was grass. We live right here is Holiday Park, the second largest city park in Cheyenne. Somebody else cuts this grass for me. And so we've been tearing out the grass because we don't need it, but we would like, more vegetables, more fruits, things like that. We do have a little portion of turf for the dog to go do its business on and for us to play a little bit. We'll be doing a little bit more over here, but we didn't need all of this to be turf. We could use it better for ourselves. So think about that for yourselves of how much turf landscape do you actually need? Are you out there playing on a true 50-yard football field every day, or do you only need enough for the dog to do its business on? And you can do other stuff in the rest of the yard. We incorporated a raspberry hedge a couple years ago. This is one of the major west to east one-way roads out of city center to the roundabout. Lots of traffic comes on here. There's a fire or a police station west of us that always shoots all the police cars straight down in the middle of the night. And so we wanted a little bit of a screen, a little bit of a hedge from both the park, from the road, from everybody walking on the sidewalk. In between my raised beds, I wanted something else because I've mulched in between these, and I didn't just want ugly, empty mulch. I wanted actually part of a garden. So I started to bring in some of those small fruit bushes. Small, most of them are 3 to 4 foot tall and wide because there's not a whole lot of room there. So I've chosen varieties that are a little bit smaller. A little bit larger varieties went back here, and this is kind of like my test area. We have some of those Hasscaps or honeyberries. I have no data on those. They're about this tall so far, so it'll be a while until we get something out of that. My herb garden is right here. This is the kitchen. This is the door out of the kitchen. If I need to go grab some herbs for dinner tonight or go from the grill, it's really easy to get to that herb garden. I look at it every day, so I know if my basil or my cilantro is getting ready to bolt, if I need to reseed to get another crop out of it. I look at this every day. And I don't mind it having a lot of really good east sun because it's not going to bolt as fast because it gets a little bit of shade at the end of the day when it's the hottest from my house. And so I can push another couple of weeks of that basil to not let it go to bolt, and I don't have to redo it. And then I have raised beds, primarily where I'm doing my vegetables, those row crops, where if I'm going to do 2 or 3 sets of carrots or things like that, they're going in these. They're heavily worked. There's no other plant in that, so I don't mind getting into the soil and roughing up the root systems. Where around my shrubs, I probably would not be planting too much crop like that I need to replant very often. I'm going to be putting in some new vegetable beds this year, probably whenever the snow melts, because I've realized there's a lot of really nice sun throughout most of the summer up here. Like I said, we just built our kitchen over here, and if I'm going to be spending a lot of time right here, it kind of makes sense to throw a couple of vegetables up there. These are small garden beds, maybe 3 by 6 at the biggest, and so trying to do a whole lot of corn in one of those hasn't really worked. So this gives me a little bit more room to do some of those bigger plants. Pumpkin, squash, things that need to run, I'm going to throw up here as well. And it's lower to the ground, these beds. These are about 3 foot tall, where this will be maybe 6 inches. And so those different types of plants will do better. And then on my patio where we're hanging out all the time, maybe I'll throw some potted herbs or things like that just to liven up the space because it's a big, ugly rock patio and I want some color, but I also don't want to take care of flowers because I do that all day for work. You know, I get paid to do that. I don't get paid to work at the house, so I want it as enjoyable for me as possible. But over here, like I said, this is the absolute driest portion of the garden. It's where I get to the least throughout the season. This is probably where I would incorporate pumpkins or something like that only have one harvest throughout a season. You know, I can run out there once or twice a week and water that one plant really heavily and leave the rest of it alone. This is what that property looks like. This is us looking south. This is kind of what it looked like when we first started. The grass was super overgrown. We cut it back. We started building these raised beds. And we realized we didn't really need all this grass because look, there's a whole park right there behind it. And look at how green that grass is compared to my grass. And somebody else cuts it and they water it and they fertilize it and they do all this stuff that I don't have to do. So I don't need grass anymore. We didn't have any irrigation, but right here is our driveway that we come in every day. My in-laws live with me. I know they're gonna get older. I know I'm gonna get older. Having a taller raised bed is literally like at hip height. I just have to hop on it and I can reach across. For a raised bed, I think 3 foot is about the best depth because that's how far I can reach into it without having to either climb up into it to get into the middle. I can see into it on either side. I have these really nice wide, I think these are like 2x12s, so I can sit on it fully and just take a load off at the end of the day. I can stand on top of them if I need to work the soil, but for the most part, they're meant to be really easy to use because if they're easy to use, I'm gonna use them more often. If it's not that great, it's a little too big, and so I have to really get around them a whole lot, and there's always that one corner that I just can't reach. And I don't feel like it today, I'm just gonna let it go. We're gonna start noticing issues with that, perhaps pests or perhaps weeds because I can't quite reach to that plant to take care of it. 3 foot wide, and then these are, I think, just 6 foot because I bought these panels and they were 3 foot wide and 2 of them make 6 foot, and that was as big as I wanted to make them. We have nothing else at the moment in the yard. We just wanted to see how the sun was in here and it did really well for us. So well, in fact, that this one, when our western sun hits that galvanized metal, it actually like reflects into the dining room and like blinds us. So I gotta go like spray paint that down this year or something. It's getting a little unbearable. So think about where your sun is for things like that. If you're gonna be using like galvanized or cedar. We also thought about, you know, we're fairly young, we're early in our careers, we don't really feel like moving, hopefully, if everything shakes out. We're gonna be here for a while. So we invested a little bit more into our raised beds. Pretty robust, it's metal, it's wood. Hopefully it lasts us 15, 20 years minimum, where depending on if you're in a rental that maybe you can't stay in super long or you don't really plan on sticking around and maybe move into a bigger property. Think about your investments, don't get too big too soon. It also means that I have spent all this time and energy and money on taking care of these beds. My wife makes me go out here and work all the time because we have these now, which is fine because I like doing it, it's great. This, I think, is last fall, so now we reduced our turf by about half in this yard. We actually took out all of the bluegrass and I reseeded it with blue graham and buffalo grass, so I don't have to water my grass as often. It's okay with the dog, it's not the greatest, she really tears it up, but it's green sometime during the year and it's there the rest of it, and that's great for me. The other portion we just mulched in and we're starting to put in these berry bushes. I actually have asparagus right here, rhubarb as well. There's our raspberry hedge that you really can't tell with the chain link fence. I have currants, I have gooseberries. I use these black tree planting containers for all of my potted plant needs. This is where my tomatoes and peppers, potatoes, I've done Cape gooseberries, anything that really needs to be planted somewhere hot and warm. And I like using these, they're free, so that's always great. They're black, black absorbs heat. And so they get a little bit warmer than any other color would throughout the day. I can move them around, so if I feel like having a new landscape this year, I just have to go move a few pots, and it's pretty easy. I also have some grapes going up the chain link fence that we're gonna experiment with this year. You can see I have these two strategically located, so the dog will stop stepping on it and breaking it. That worked. It didn't work for the raspberries, but it will work for grapevines. But it also gives me, you know, the ability, when my son was younger, I could corral those around some of these bushes that have a little bit bigger of a thorn, so he would stay away from them, and now that he knows a little bit better, he'll figure it out. Eventually, we're gonna get a hold of some chickens, and this is the area we look at every day, and so that's where that's gonna go instead of on the back side of the property where we're never at. Here's a little bit cleaner of a picture that you can see. Like I said, we reduced our turf by about half. We have both tall raised beds and short raised beds. Leafy greens, root crops, things like that go in this during the summer because the house blocks this bed really well in that high heat of the day. It's also taller, so that those leafy greens I need to go cut for salad tonight are right here instead of down here. Where something like corn or a pumpkin went there last year because it can be this tall or it can just spread out on the ground, and I don't really care. I'm not bending down all the time for this one. Here's a different shot. You know, it's not the greatest hedge. It does better in the summer when there's leaves on it, but it could be junipers, it could be a cotoneaster hedge. It would look exactly the same. There's no leaves on it. It looks like brown sticks. But come summer, there's raspberries on it. There's raspberry leaf, which can be used in teas or things like that. The asparagus are rhubarbs, and we're gonna start incorporating more perennial or things that will self-sow in this portion of the garden this year. If you've noticed, every year, every season, we've done just a little bit more. We didn't start out to make it one year look like this. It took us a couple of seasons, but it's how much we wanted to work with that season so that eventually we're really enjoying it. We didn't have to kill ourselves this first year to get to it. And we're gonna mix and match. I always do new varieties of tomatoes and peppers. I don't know why, I don't eat either one of them, but it's nice to have the ability to like mix and match and find new things and do stuff like that. And I think that's it. What questions do we have? So the question was, how do we prevent in the Children's Village specifically when we mix our edible plantings with our ornamental plantings, those toxic and non-toxic plants together? The biggest way is the Children's Village for us is meant to be touched with, played with, stomped on. We know those plants either have to be tough and they have to be fairly non-toxic. You know, there are a couple of things that if we ate enough of it, it probably would be pretty bad for a kid. The human brain is pretty good. If it tastes bad, we're gonna spit it out. But we don't have many, I really couldn't tell you what potentially toxic plants we have in the Children's Village for that reason. Out on the rest of the grounds, yeah, there's a couple of things that if you ate enough of it, it probably would upset your stomach or lead to farther and farther, you know, poison issues. But we really don't do that in the Children's Village for the reason of we know what that use is gonna be. So kind of the same way when we talk about the uses of our zones, Zone 1, Zone 2, and Zone 3, that was part of that landscape scheme of we know there's gonna be between 1 and 8-year-olds in here all day, every day, pulling everything, picking everything, eating everything. It's got to be able to stand up to that, and also the kids got to be able to stand up to that. Other questions? The question was, have I noticed any difference in like insect activity? I would say yes, but that was because at the same time we incorporated a pollinator garden. But I noticed that was perhaps the influx that gave them a starting point, and now they're everywhere. Insects are usually not picky. If there's a flower there that they can land on and they can get a nectar from, they're gonna figure it out, they're gonna come back, and they're gonna see what else is nearby, which is great if you have a vegetable garden and it has a fruit in it, which is a tomato, a pepper, a squash, that last stage of plant growth. Put really nice bee-attracting flowers around it because tomato plants are not attractive to most pollinators. So by using that design principle of we want insects in the same place for 2 different reasons, I've noticed that really helps. Diversity by far has shot up because we no longer have a monoculture of bluegrass turf. We have 2 to 3 species of grass. Most of that is kind of like bunch grass. The buffalo grass is more of a turf type, but there's a lot of bare area as well in that grass, which is good for most of our native bees are ground dwelling. They need bare earth. That helps out with that. In those areas that the wind blows the mulch off of, I'm usually pretty late to get it covered back up because every time I go out, I see like someone stabbed a pencil into it, and that's those ground nesting bees it's gotten in. If there's a flower on it, obviously it's attractive to a plant versus like a juniper where there's not so much of a, or attractive to an insect, where it's not that attractive. Other questions? So the question was, she lives out where there's pretty rocky soil, and how does shrubs and things work with that? The biggest benefit you can give any plant out here in the West is mulch. Mulch does a lot of things. I always push towards, I like really fresh wood chips, and I like them really thick. And if you water them more often than you think, they're gonna start to decompose a little bit faster. You want them really nice and thick because that's gonna prevent that water loss. If you think of the ground as this sponge that sits on the kitchen sink, As the day goes on and the air moves across it, it dries out. But if you cover it up with like Tupperware or something like that, it'll stay wet longer. That's what your mulch is doing. And for most of our gardens, like I said, it was all bluegrass when we began. We didn't tear out the bluegrass, we smothered it with mulch, and then we came in and planted through that. And when we pulled the mulch off for that little pot to go in, it was as black and as wet as it could be, and we didn't water, just from that season of snow being held in one place. Yeah, usually it's cheap and or free if you can get a hold of it. A lot of the wood mulch I showed was that really dark brown. It was shredded wood mulch. It normally comes from the bark of a tree rather than the interior wood of a tree that is chipped. Pros and cons to using shredded or chipped. Shredded mulch tends to be from the bark, so it has a lot more like natural oils and water resistant compounds in it, which is great if you don't want to remulch that often. But if you're looking for that mulch to break down, you want to go through chips because they are going to degrade a little bit faster. At the Botanic Gardens, we use both of them in different applications. Tree rings, shrub beds, anywhere where we're looking for like some fertility or a little bit more organic content, or where it's on the interior of the garden so the wind is not as prevalent. We'll use those wood chips. We get them for free from city forestry, so that's one reason, is because it's expensive otherwise. Our retention ponds, the western side of the Botanic Gardens, I used them in my garden because we had nothing else in the yard to prevent that wind. They stay put after like one snow or one heavy water cycle, but they don't break down. So they're really good for like commercial applications, I think, because you don't have to go weed and remulch as often, but there's really no life cycle happening. I definitely don't recommend using them in like a wildflower or a pollinator garden where you do want those annual or biennial seeds to come up every so often. If it's too thick of that shredded mulch, it'll actually impede that process and you'll end up having a loss of your garden because a lot of our wildflowers are short-lived perennials. But yeah, around like tree bases, like I said, the retention ponds for our parking lot, they stay put very, very well. But we know, there's that trade-off of what we're going to use it for. Awesome. I know Cheyenne's compost facility normally has a free mulch day in April, I want to say. So if you're here in town, check that out pretty soon. That should be happening. Are we done?
Thank you very much, Isaiah. Give me a moment.